Why are we meeting today? Well, in addition to the original comment I mentioned earlier, I think the common thread of today's twin discussion, and we have it today just to avoid proliferating meetings on agendas. There's a certain community has been grown with this project, and therefore we thought we're practical to address this today into separate sessions. But the common thread is, are we measuring what truly matters for economic development, what truly matters for territories? Are we measuring things that really relevant of how people actually live and where it actually lives? The first session precisely is going to be discussed about GDP. GDP has dominated our understanding on development for many decades, but it's not enough. And for those of us who are being in the EU policy and EU budget roundabout, which is a cycle every 7 years, so I have a few that roundabouts in my belt. This is the right moment of the policy cycle where we discuss beyond GDP, and then the decisions are made not necessarily to go much beyond what we have at the moment as of measuring prosperity and how do we measure policies. But I believe in connection with the second seminar we will have after this one, the second half of this morning, we are assisting a quiet revolution on how we measure performance of EU funds, and EU funds are key drivers of economic development and prosperity in most European regions. And that perhaps offers new avenues to measure more accurately how a problem, where is the problem, what are the beneficiaries of the problem, what are the impacts of the different challenges, who's actually receiving support for that public support, EU or domestic. And actually that's in the nature of the granular project, which is, as its name says, and perhaps cheekily so, is to look at the granularity of policy interventions, to go beyond the big figures, the macro figures, the national or even regional, and trying to go as down as possible, sometimes at square kilometer level. And that display sensitivities is what we are going to try to understand today and how we can actually advance. I'm very glad to have a number of very reputed speakers in both sessions. As I say, Webinar A will be focusing on beyond GDP and what is needed, what can be done in the current state of play. And then Webinar B, which is happening in the second half of this morning, will focus on the performance framework of the new EU budget that is being discussed as we speak, just a few kilometers where we are here based in Brussels in ADL. But without further ado, I believe perhaps my colleague Maite would like to introduce the speakers and prevent me speaking too long, as always happens. So thank you very much. Maite, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Serafin. My name is Maite Iglesias, and I'm in charge together with my team of the communication of the Granular project. We are moving for the first part of the session, where we will explore how we can go beyond GDP from policy frameworks to more concrete indicators. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our first speaker, Laura Reiner, from the SOE Institute for Future Fit Economies. Laura brings over 20 years of experience working in and around EU policymaking, with a strong expertise in policy development, stakeholder engagement, and sustainable policymaking. Today, she will help us understand why GDP alone is no longer sufficient and how alternative metrics can better reflect well-being, sustainability, and distribution across society. So please, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. There we go. So hopefully you can see me. I've now lost you, but I'm going to trust that you're all still there. Yeah, great. Yes, after all these years on Teams, it would be really fantastic if there was a slightly better way of doing this. But anyway, indeed, as was said, and I was slightly horrified to hear from myself, I've been working in and around Brussels for 20 years, though today I'm speaking to you from a very rainy Lilongwe in Malawi. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of a why, when, and for whom we're talking about when we're talking about beyond GDP metrics in Europe. So just to say from the Zoe Institute side, we've been working on this topic really since the Institute was founded We've been currently working in the MERGE project, which I think Peter will probably mention in his presentation later. Also the WISE Horizons project and the MAPS project are all Horizon Europe projects working in and around this topic. So let's see if it's, there we go, right. See, I wonder if my computer has a lag or whether we're going to jump a few slides forward in a minute. Okay, here we go. So in terms of beyond GDP, what are we talking about? Well, let's start with where we're talking about GDP, which of course measures the market value of goods and services. Beyond GDP, the idea of beyond GDP is to complement this focus on GDP with metrics which look at sustainability, well-being, inclusion, distribution. And while it might seem perhaps that beyond GDP is a relatively new concept, actually it's been around pretty much as long as GDP has been around as in terms of a measure of in terms of a measure of national welfare. If you look on the timeline on the side of the slide, even in 1937, when Simon Kuznets presented GDP to Congress, he already made the comment that this isn't a measure of national welfare. It shouldn't be seen as a measure of national welfare. And yet here we are. So in terms of the why of this question, why GDP isn't enough? Well, I mean, I don't suppose that anyone attending this seminar is really shocked to hear some of these observations, but indeed there's an awful lot of issues when you're just looking at GDP, because of course you don't then see the aspects of our society that don't have a market value, or at least a monetary market value. So we're not looking at then unpaid work, care work. We're not looking at health. We're not looking at distributional issues. We're not looking at the environmental depletion that goes with this focus on GDP. Also subjective well-being as well. It also can create perverse incentives. So, of course, growth can mask social and ecological harm. It can mask declining life quality. And ultimately, it can mislead policy and investment decisions. If we're just looking at how to create more market value, then, well, I mean, you can see it with your own eyes in your own cities, in your own regions, that ultimately there can be places with very high GDP, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't social or environmental stresses alongside that. In terms of from the leadership on this topic, like I said, it's been around for a very long time, and it does feel in the last 2 decades, I suppose, that this is being taken perhaps more seriously than it was previously. This is an excerpt from a speech that Commission President von der Leyen made a couple of years ago. It was Robert Kennedy back in the 1960s who famously said that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile, the health of our children, or the joy of their play. Today, on a very fundamental level, we understand Kennedy's wisdom, that economic growth is not an end in itself, that growth must not destroy its own foundations, that growth must serve people and future generations. So luckily, in terms of what alternatives exist, and I guess I'm not going to spend too long on this because you'll hear more from the other speakers on this in much more detail, but just to maybe give a kind of overview of where we are. At the moment, there are already numerous indexes and dashboards that already exist, which can give you a kind of complementary view on progress beyond GDP. Just for background information, for those who don't spend days looking at dashboards, indicators, and indexes, an index is a summary number. So, for instance, a Human Development Index will take the performance of a country on issues like education, health, income, and condense it into one number. Whereas with a dashboard of indicators, the idea is that you see across the whole spectrum of dimensions of progress. So you can see, for instance, a dashboard might have indicators on carbon dioxide emissions and also health and income inequality, gender disparities. And so it doesn't try to condense it into one number. It gives you the whole, indeed, dashboard of view. So this WISE triangle on the side of the slide, this was created for the WISE Horizons project, but it brings together the dozens of beyond GDP metrics that have been proposed over the last few decades. And this is actually only including those that have been proposed at national level. So it doesn't include, you know, any regional or investment metrics as well. And okay, from my perspective, of course, no single metric will ever fit all uses. In the end, you'll always need a combination of uses, and they have to be designed for specific contexts. And this is why, you know, although beyond GDP sometimes seems slightly controversial, in the end, if we've had this focus on GDP, which is such a blunt instrument in terms of its sort of assessment of how society is doing, then the idea that this is radical is a little bit bizarre to me. Again, I'll only just briefly go over this because, yeah, there's other things to say in the short time I have available, but just to highlight that there's an awful lot of things that are actually happening on this. At the EU level, we've seen the integration of SDG monitoring into the European semester, which is primarily focused on economic governance monitoring. So again, trying to bring in these other aspects of progress into the monitoring that's happening at European level. We've also got organizations like the OECD, the World Health Organization, doing work on well-being through the OECD WISE Center, the WHO working with finance ministries, treasuries in member states to try and get them to think of, for instance, with WHO, this One Health approach. So you can't make economic fiscal policies in a vacuum. You have to be thinking about how this is going to impact in terms of prevention spending and so on. At the UN level, there's also an awful lot going on right now, really right now. In the next few months, we should see the publication of the high-level expert group on beyond GDP, their findings, which will be then discussed and voted on later in the year. We've also got the roadmap for eradicating poverty beyond GDP, which should be also out in the next few months. And of course, they've last year reformed the system of national accounts, which is also really vital in terms of how we create the information needed to use these indicators, these metrics. And also in the national and regional level, local levels as well, we're seeing an awful lot of things happening. Some perhaps more known than others. For instance, I would say that Wales is really leading the way, certainly in the continent of Europe, with their Wellbeing of Future Generations work, really trying to bring in this multi-dimensional approach to policy making, really trying to think for future generations, so this much longer term view. We've also seen the establishment of donut cities like Amsterdam and Brussels, and also there are a number of countries in Europe which have now well-being dashboards in some way integrated into policy making, with different aspects, but the thinking is there. So now onto the when to think beyond GDP, and it's probably unsurprising to hear me say all the time, but for me this is such a valuable way of approaching policy decisions, approaching financial decisions, budgeting, and so on. So I'm not going to go through all of the points, but just to kind of highlight a few. So indeed with agenda setting or identifying problems, or using this beyond GDP approach helps to identify issues that GDP masks. You can use median income or poverty rates or wealth data to really understand who's being left behind, because in the end, GDP per capita can mask median stagnation. Or indeed time use data, which would then provide a much better view as to whether unpaid care work, primarily done by women, is limiting labor opportunities and so on. Also another one, strategic or long-term planning. Again, taking this intergenerational equity approach, tracking intergenerational mobility and wealth distribution is going to give you a much better view than indeed just thinking about market value of something. With crisis response and recovery planning, as we've seen with COVID, taking this beyond GDP approach can also help to avoid locking in harmful trajectories at moments of crisis. with budgeting and fiscal policy, if you can align your spending and taxation with social and environmental objectives, if you can use green or social budget tagging to properly assess where the spending is going and the impact that it's having. Also, similarly, with public engagement and communications, and I think this is perhaps one of the most important, if you can engage with citizens to build the goals that they want to see in their locality in the first place, especially over a very long term. So asking them to look ahead to the city, the region that they want to see in 2040, 2050. It actually also provides a transparency for decisions. It also helps to explain the trade-offs that politicians are facing when it comes to very difficult decisions or budgeting decisions. And also having this sort of transparent reporting of outcomes can then also help push for equitable policies in the long term as well. And so, yeah, finally, for whom? Well, again, I mean, I would unsurprisingly say for everyone. I mean, I've put some points here next to the different categories, but actually all of them cross over and they're all relevant to each and every category. Ultimately, indeed, I think we have enough evidence to say that the sole focus on GDP is not only insufficient, it's actually damaging. And we've also got enough evidence now, I think, with numerous models and metrics, indicators, but also place-based experience in different contexts to see that this is a positive approach to policy making. Precisely as I already said, engaging people in designing the policies and the approaches that you're going to implement in their areas can not only bring, strengthen our democratic systems, but also provide, well, for want of a better word, perhaps political cover for some of the really difficult decisions. In the end, in my own town, with a big citizen consultation at the beginning of the mandate of our local authority, people told them what we wanted to see, and unsurprisingly, it was a greener, safer, more sustainable, more socially fair city. But then, of course, the same people may very well complain when their parking spaces are reduced, or when mobility plans are changed, so you can't drive from A to B so directly. But actually, it allows them politicians to then point back at, well, no, this is the decision that you took. This is what you want to see, and now we're acting on it. And actually then give it a few years to bed in, and suddenly you'll find that people are a little bit sheepish about their initial reticence when you can really see the impact that having this long-term and the sort of broader approach can have. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for this insightful overview, highlighting why GDP alone is not enough to capture well-being and sustainability. And building on this, we now move from the why to the how, looking at how these ideas are being translated into concrete frameworks and indicators at the EU level. It's my pleasure now to introduce Peter Venture, a scientific officer at the UN Research Center of the European Commission. Peter is one of the coordinators of the Commission's work on sustainable and inclusive well-being, an initiative developed through the strategic foresight reports to complement the GDP with broader and more meaningful metrics. Today, he will present how these approaches are being translated into concrete indicators to better capture well-being and support decision-making. So please, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me try to share the screen. I hope you see the screen and only the screen.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for the opportunity. Let me talk about this Commission initiative on sustainable and inclusive well-being, which is in a sense a new title, and I'll be talking about that later for Beyond GDP. As was mentioned earlier, this initiative was reborn in a series of strategic foresight reports. Actually, the the new wave of interest in beyond GDP and well-being in a more in a broader sense emerged around the COVID shock, when people started to realize again that maybe there is more to life than what we previously thought. So already this 2020 strategic foresight report was talking about the need to have an integrated approach to measuring people's well-being. The next year's, the 2021 strategic foresight report, was already calling the resilience dashboards, which were developed upon the initiative of the previous one by us. So actually that was our entry point into the field. So it was painted as an important step towards a more integrated approach for measuring well-being beyond GDP. And 2023, which I would say was the heyday, the peak of this new interest, was the 2023 Strategic Foresight Report, which announced this new internal work on developing sustainable and inclusive well-being metrics for the EU to complement GDP. You may remember, or many of you probably remember, that was also the year of the Big Beyond Growth Conference, from which the speech of President von der Leyen, I think, was quoted by Lauro. So that was 2023, and then I must say that the priority and the interest shifted notably with the new elections and the focus on competitiveness. But still, the work which was launched in 23 went on. I'll be talking about what we have achieved, and there was at least some recognition in the new Commission's first strategic foresight report from 2025, saying that the work, especially the dashboard and indicator selection, was marked as mature enough to be embedded into policy evaluation, investment and reform decision making. Unfortunately, this is not a statement, this is an imperative. It's more that they should be embedded. It's not that they are already embedded. So we are at the door, but we still need to enter. So what is this sustainable inclusive well-being approach? The way we defined it, and I think that's a nice extension actually of the well-being economy framework, is this should be the well-being of all people, of current and future generations, and of the planet. So there is the sustainability aspect, which is the planet and the future generations, the inclusion, which is the all people, and obviously there is well-being, which it's always important to remember is actually defined as one of the core objectives of the EU by the EU treaty. But this term sustainable and inclusive well-being is actually seen as an emerging new consensus, as a connecting term of the beyond GDP very fragmented landscape. Laura was already referring to and was showing actually the same merged triangle from the device triangle from the Device Horizon project, the work of Rutger Hoekstra and many others. But there is also the Merge project, which tries to connect the dot, and that's also talking about policy pathways to sustainable and inclusive well-being. The UN Network of Economic Statisticians has been actually working on a framework for inclusive and sustainable well-being. And if you read into the interim report and the new material gradually released by the high-level expert group on beyond GDP of the UN, they also talk about, inclusive and equitable, but more or less the same thing. So sustainability, inclusion, and equitable and well-being. So how we started to translate this into practical measurement terms, it's very much a variant of the, I would say, the standard blueprint of the OECD, which emerged from the first Stiglitz report, which talks about the distinction of well-being today and well-being tomorrow. Of course, it's not straightforward to measure well-being tomorrow, so we put it there more as a placeholder. But well-being today read in a multidimensional way, but also with the subjective overall life expectancy, life experience, or life satisfaction being included. Then there is in between the sustainability, which has two main parts: the capitals or the resources for the future, and resilience, which is how you deal with challenges and how you manage the sustainability transitions. Now, within the capitals, we only talk about human, social, and economic capital. And we took nature out to say that this is not just one of the resources for humanity. This is actually something beyond. This is more a foundation. And it's not only nature, not only natural capital, but also one needs to think of the planetary boundaries. Then we also have inclusiveness, which can be seen as the distribution of almost any of the measures, but we thought it's important to emphasize it as a general transversal component. And finally, another foundation, institutional capacity and quality. Sometimes it is even labeled as institutional capital. I think it's a matter of words, but that's, again, something very fundamental for generating well-being and also measuring progress. So how to build this measurement framework? One of our tasks, actually, more or less implicitly mentioned in the 8th Environmental Action Program, was also use this work to do some synthesis, to do some stock taking and streamlining of the zillions of existing EU tools. So the first thing we did is we took more than 20 EU and a couple of global frameworks which roughly concentrate on well-being, and we map them into the structure of the previous slide to see how comprehensive, how balanced, how detailed or oversampling these frameworks are. And the conclusions were, I'm only showing here some of the most comprehensive and overarching frameworks, but still they are typically sectorial. So they don't cover all the aspects. There are some exceptions like the USDGs, but even there you do have some imbalances. Some areas are over, some other are undersampled, and they have 100 indicators. So we felt that indeed there is a case for putting these together and trying to select from them in a balanced way. So first we pulled all these indicators. That was more than 1,000. Of course, there are many duplicates or near duplicates. So when that was all scrutinized, that was still almost 500. And from that, we used our inter-service working group. We consulted representatives of all Commission services to prioritize and select from these indicators into rounds. First, we managed to go down to around 150, 140. If you get rid of those variables which look good, but actually there is not good enough or there isn't good data coverage. And then in a major next hurdle, we tried to go down. The original target was 20, like what the UN high-level expert group is targeting, but we could go only to 50 because going beyond would have risked the consensus of the services. Everybody would have said, oh, something which is really important is already missing. So this is what we got at the end, a roughly balanced indicator of 50, spanning all the EU frameworks and at the same time having some sort of minimum buy-in and consensus from all Commission services. What can we do with these indicators? So the first one is, okay, just to give you some sense, but I think it's more for distribution, or you can read also in the reports. These are the kind of indicators, nothing major, nothing shocking. These are the usual ones which you have in the SDGs or the European Pillar of Social Rights or the 8th Environmental Action Plan monitoring. So these are mostly existing indicators. We also combine them into synthetic measures by components. So what you see here is a color coding. Dark blue means that the country is in the top range of the situation or the performance. The deep orange means it's in the bottom part. You see that in the latest year, 2023, which the data allowed, there is quite some heterogeneity among countries on the one hand, but also within the various components. So it's not that countries are good in all aspects. Some are better in well-being today, but not so good in nature or inequalities. So a single number can be useful, but it always masks the underlying heterogeneity. Another important thing which we can do is to look at the time series. We have data from 2011 in a reliable way, and you can see that relative to the improvements in GDP, the well-being today, or the overall sustainable and inclusive well-being index, improved even more. You see that there were some drawbacks around COVID, but there was a gradual and a massive improvement. And then you can look at the other components. You can look at the countries. So there is a big richness of information which you can get from here. Let me show you one other EU initiative, which is actually older than this one, which is the regional EU version of the Social Progress Index, which by now even has a local, a city level measure. This is championed by DG Regio. It uses a bit different, I would say, more tilted towards current well-being with some extensions. These are the three main pillars and then the 9 overall dimensions. But what it can do is it is available at the NUTS 2 level. So it can show that there is, maybe this chart is not doing justice to the results because it doesn't show huge heterogeneity, but still you can see that like within Italy, within Spain, there are some regions which are much better than some others. And here I pasted from their October 25 report, which was looking at even sub-regional, like cities, towns, rural areas. And you do see there are some systematic patterns that in most countries, the social progress index is higher in cities than in rural areas. So that's, I think this connects nicely to the granular work program. One last thing, and then I pass the floor, is actually go the opposite direction, not more granular from countries to regions and cities, but to go global, go beyond the EU, because one of the key objectives of especially the EU beyond GDP, sustainable and inclusive well-being agenda, was to track the EU's sustainability transition and its performance in a global comparison. These days, it's essentially a EU-US comparison that everybody is interested in. You may have seen some top-level recent ECB speeches, which was taking actually a very strong beyond GDP comparison as a starting point. Was not saying beyond GDP, but was looking at those kind of indicators. So I collected here some ingredients from our work. Okay, this is just GDP per capita, what we know, that the US actually started from a higher level and grew a bit more in the last decade. But, and this is an interesting measure, it's an augmented GDP where GDP or household income was augmented by life expectancy, the distribution of life expectancy, and also the distribution of income. And with this, as you go from the blue columns, which is the no adjustment, to the all adjustments, which is this light peach column on the right, you see that the comparison between the EU and the US totally changes. US used to be higher and was growing more. This is no longer the case. The EU is higher and the US was more stagnating while the EU was still growing. So this is one piece of comparison. A second, which is another useful sort of summary measure, life satisfaction. There has always been a major advantage of the US, but this has almost disappeared by the end of the period. And then something which unfortunately I can only show as work in progress. When we extended our dashboard to an OECD setting, we would have liked to go even beyond, but it was not possible due to data limitations. You would see the same, that the overall sustainable inclusive well-being or current well-being and most other components are higher in the EU and improved more. What I can just briefly flip and then I stop. These are the ingredients of the current well-being component, where you see that with very few exceptions, the blue line, which is the EU, is always higher and has been improving more. So in this global comparison, in a beyond GDP setting, the case of who is more developed or who is progressing more, EU, US, which model is superior, it's not as straightforward as many people would say. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for showing how different dimensions of well-being can be brought together in a more integrated way. And to complement this perspective, we now move closer to the realities on the ground and explore how these concepts translate into people's life experiences, particularly in rural areas. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Gundi Nis from the Thunen Institute. Gundi is a quantitative researcher with extensive experience in economics, social policy, and sociology, working on topics such as life satisfaction, inequality, and neighborhood effects. Today, she will present insights from the GRANULAR project on rural well-being and quality of life, highlighting how well-being is multidimensional and strongly shaped by the local context. So please, Gundi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, for the introduction, and also thank you to Laura for presenting the general sort of perspective on beyond GDP and a specific measure that Piotr had to present the results from the Well-being and Quality of Life in Rural Europe report. And Serafin has asked me or challenged me to elaborate some more on how these results and findings relate to the broader discussion about moving beyond GDP as a key economic outcome of development and what this means for rural areas. So, well, I'm a happiness researcher, and I do, of course, know quite well that happiness and well-being is influenced by more than just economic conditions. So, next slide. Already in his 2005 book, Happiness, Lessons from a New Science, Richard Layard summarized that subjective well-being is influenced by multiple factors, and this includes economic circumstances, but also family and community relationships and personal resources such as values and freedom. So, and in rural areas, these non-economic resources are, of course, often particularly important. So we know from talking to local actors that many rural communities benefit from strong social networks and connectedness to the local natural resources, and all these can support well-being. At the same time, rural residents may face challenges related to access to services or economic opportunities. And so it's quite natural for me to think that understanding rural development requires actually looking at other factors than just the economic indicators alone. And also that we need to consider multiple dimensions of well-being. Next slide. So in our work, we conceptualize subjective well-being as a multidimensional construct that consists of personal well-being with its evaluative and affective components, and also psychological functioning, the extent to which people can satisfy their basic psychological needs to be autonomous, to relate to others and feel competent, and their mental resources like optimism and resilience. And then on the other hand, next to these personal well-being components, we have social well-being. That is the quality of the local social environment, whether there is support and trust, that sort of thing. And earlier today, we have heard that like Peter said, that in his sort of SIWB measure, there is actually not a lot of subjective well-being instances. So I think the only indicator Peter has cited is life satisfaction. But our approach is really to say that subjective well-being is important, but subjective well-being is more than just life satisfaction. So here we can see that when we look at perceived well-being and also affective well-being and evaluative well-being, etc., that these different dimensions can quite differently relate to rurality. So, for instance, while the natural environment may positively influence affective well-being, like we enjoy seeing a green sort of field or lovely flowers, or we adore the mountains and enjoy mountains, etc., which can affect affective well-being most likely, the local economic opportunities may dampen evaluative well-being. So, and that's something that we observe in life satisfaction. For instance, life satisfaction suffers from, I don't know, losing your job, having a lower income, etc. Next slide. So in our research, we started with a review of the empirical literature, the quantitative empirical literature for Europe. And we wanted to know whether there is actually a rural-urban difference in subjective well-being. And so we found that there are actual sort of rural advantages in subjective well-being, but not for everyone. So 63% of the reported effects indicated higher rural well-being, but this was not the case for younger groups aged 15 to 25 and for older groups aged 50 or older. And what I found very interesting was that whether we found a rural difference or a rural advantage in subjective well-being also seemed to be impacted by how we define rural. So if the definition of rural area included small towns, for instance, or if the definition was based on Degurba, sparsely populated area, there we didn't find a rural advantage so much. Now, so rural advantages exist, but they seem to be uneven. Next slide. Now, we then looked at how rural area or rural well-being varies by which dimension of subjective well-being we look at. So here we used data from the European Social Survey, and we analyzed 28 European countries in terms of those different dimensions of well-being. And what we found is that the highest levels of well-being are not always in villages or the countryside. For instance, if we look at life satisfaction, the highest well-being is in rural settlements, so that's villages or countryside, in only about 50% of the countries. But if we look at social well-being next to it, we can see that there's hardly any countries where social well-being is associated with living in cities. So the green dots on these maps, they indicate the countryside or villages, whilst the red and black dots indicate cities and suburbs. So need satisfaction, for instance, is more clearly associated with urban living on the other hand. And so the implication is that it's important to look beyond a single indicator of subjective well-being as well as different types of rural areas. So we see there's a difference between living in the countryside or in villages, for instance. And because we are rural researchers and policy folks, we of course know that rural areas are heterogeneous. So that's what we look at in the next chapter. So here we looked more closely at how specific local contexts shape subjective well-being. And we use panel data for Britain and show that there is a consistent 0.15 point rural advantage in life satisfaction. And about 30 to 50% of this advantage is actually explained by neighborhood socio-demographic type, by area deprivation, or by individual characteristics, respectively. Now, when we zoom in on rural areas, it's the lifestyles of the local population which is the strongest predictor of subjective well-being or life satisfaction in this case. While in urban areas, it's area deprivation and access to services. So in other words, local context matters for subjective well-being, but it matters differently in rural and urban settings. Next slide. So then in our final analysis, we look at a phenomenon which is said to be related specifically to rural development. That is the deployment of wind turbines. As the figure shows, exposure to wind turbines has increased significantly between 2000 and 2020 in Germany, with an increasing share of both rural and urban households living within 6 kilometers of wind turbines. Now, while economic and climate benefits of wind turbines are widely recognized, there is ongoing debate about possible health and well-being impacts. And that's, of course, something that we know from research, but also from policy. There's always like trade-offs that we have to sort of consider, you know, what's good in one dimension of well-being or economic development might not be good, quite so good in other developments. So here, we use German panel data linked to publicly available wind turbine data and focus on residential non-movers. And we compare the short-term changes in health-related quality of life before and after exposure for non-movers who become exposed to wind turbines with similar non-movers who are not exposed. So, and overall, our results suggest that average changes in quality of life or health-related quality of life are small, but, and we do not find any evidence of adverse effects on mental health in general, But in areas where are people who have been exposed to a larger number of wind turbines within some sort of radius, so that's radius up to 4 kilometers, we find that there is a small sort of negative effect, a very small negative effect on mental health-related quality of life. And there's also some suggestive evidence of close proximity effects for physical health-related quality of life of larger turbines in these areas. So I don't really want to go like into these details into this sort of research with some talk very much about it, because you all have the opportunity to read the report. So the key point here is really that there are trade-offs in rural development. So while wind turbines may be good for the environment and local economy overall, they have to be carefully sited, and we really do need sort of very detailed and local panel data of context and people's well-beings, different dimensions, etc., to make of it or to actually do these kind of analyses. Next slide. So let me wrap up. The findings point to a broader conclusion about how we should measure rural well-being and development outcomes. First, rural well-being cannot be captured by economic indicators alone. It is multidimensional and includes social, psychological, and environmental dimensions. Second, rural well-being advantages are real, but they are not universal. They depend on who we study, what we measure, and how we define rural. Third, local context matters. Neighborhood conditions, service access, and exposure intensity all shape individual well-being outcomes. And so overall, this highlights the importance of granular and place-sensitive indicators and beyond GDP approaches to capture what really matters for rural well-being. So thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gundi, for this very insightful presentation, and also for highlighting the valuable work carried out within the GRANULAR project. We now move to the discussion part of the session, so I would like to give the floor back to Serafin, who will moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you, Maite, and thank you to the three speakers. I think there's been 45 minutes of a journey from the world to Europe to the much more local dimension in only 45 minutes. If anybody, like policymakers or students, need to revise up what the whole state of question of beyond GDP, you got it there. There's going to be a video, there's going to be a report. So basically, as I say, an incredibly engaging and very comprehensive guide. I will be keen before I have a number of questions, so I've been just scribbling and revising them. But before I speak too much, I'll be keen to and just checking as we speak the chat, because I see there's a number of questions, and before making some questions I've just been drafting myself. I wonder if I see Laura. I just looking at the website or the chat. My colleagues correct me if I'm wrong, but I see Laura Kinzule making a question for Laura Gnis. Well, actually, it's a question of data coverage. I mean, perhaps Gundi can confirm why Latvia was not included in this study. I'm sure that it's a very obvious question, but I'm sure I'll let you to answer that if you want. Thank you.
I guess that's a European social survey analysis, isn't it?
Yeah, I think
yeah.
so.
So probably we use data from the round 6 of the European Social Survey, and this probably didn't include Latvia, because we included all European countries that had complete data available.
Yeah. I just checking. Actually, there's one from Elda. I'm not sure who's actually the director to, but any of you, the three of you might wish to answer. Whether in the discussions on beyond GDP, do you consider traditional practice and cultural heritage as indicators of well-being? I know it is, but any of the three of you would like to elaborate on that? That's something that comes very strongly in a number of other policy research we are doing, and therefore perhaps it's something that the three of you would like to comment. Maybe Peter, as you just read the floor. Thank you.
So I've already started to reply in the chat, but it's better to say it together. So in I would say many or maybe even most national frameworks, these are typically there. If you look at New Zealand, Scotland, Wales, there are the issues about national identity, issues about indigenous people. They are there. It's more difficult to do it in a multi-country, like in an EU or in a global sense. So I think that is one of the challenges of the global work, is to do something which is common, but at the same time give way and maybe even prompt areas where the local content of like this can be and should be brought in. But these are, I mean, these are not straightforward issues, but they are absolutely recognized and important.
Thank you. Maybe I'd like to comment, and it's actually good because I mean both Lara and me will have some association with Scotland, and countries with the so-called new public management tend to be very good at that. But actually, you mentioned, I believe, Ecuador, which is a different political culture. So maybe you'd like to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, precisely as Peter said, there are examples, but yeah, I wasn't able to speak from the European perspective, so I'm glad that Peter already did that. But I mean, this is why I think, as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, these conversations with the citizens at the beginning of this pathway are so important. For instance, with Wales, it really was a national conversation. It was called a national conversation to really understand from people, the aspects of what do they think their society should look like, what aspects do they value in their lives, and having that right at the beginning, whether that's coming from indigenous communities or whether that's coming from newcomers into your cities and to your countries, it's still valuable to get that perspective. And like I said, the absolute ideal, and I'm not saying that it always happens this way, but the ideal is you start with that. You build from really the bottom up with this consultation exercise with people, and then you start designing policies that respond to these needs. And at the same time as designing these policies, you already figure out the indicators that you're going to use to track them, because still too often in Brussels especially, we're doing that after the fact. So we've designed this excellent policy, and now we have to figure out how we're going to actually assess this, and which aspects we think are important to assess, which too often is still monetary, economic.
Indeed, and maybe good that you can complement on that, because I mean the issue about context and participation, it is central to the issue of assessing impacts in rural areas, or like rural proofing. I mean, this is actually, obviously, this is also a piece of work that is done by other colleagues in Granular, but maybe you could reflect on, are we doing good enough? I mean, we have some countries, like Germany has a number of practices on rural proofing, on basically community involvement to identify impacts, others as well, but maybe like to try to reflect on that, whether we should introduce into policy making a bigger element of participation than we have at the moment. We have, first, the Rural Pact, which, for disclaimer, ADL facilitates, but there might be other things that we could do. I don't know, based on the experience you have done in terms of understanding context, we'd like to elaborate further on that. Thank you.
I'm not sure I share that Germany is doing like so much in terms of rural proofing. I mean, certainly not from the sort of national analysis sort of perspective. I know that there's a lot of people, for instance, in the LEADER projects or program, which are very engaged and have a lot of engagement, etc. But so I'm really coming from the quant side, and with national surveys, and there we don't have a very good basis for tracking, like how policy initiatives sort of impact rural people's quality of life, I think. So, and perhaps like with that wind turbine analysis that I've done, so there we have really great data, and of course it's a matter that is really heavily politicized in local communities, and we, if I look at previous research on that matter, the authors of that research have decided to only look at rural areas, and they threw away all the sort of people who live in cities or in towns, and so I thought what was actually quite interesting was to see that actually it's not only rural people who are impacted by wind turbines, because if you build a wind turbine in your local community, you also want to sort of build it as far as possible away from your sort of local people, so you actually reach the boundaries of another community. And therefore in Berlin, for instance, we don't have any wind turbines, but the people who live in Berlin, quite a few of them at the edges have wind turbines within their sort of community. So it's complicated, like to actually gather the data that you need, and if you consider like how much heterogeneity there is in rural contexts, like villages or living in the countryside, then if you want to actually collect the data, it becomes really, really expensive. It's almost like you have to run censuses of subjective well-being and multiple dimensions. I think it's probably a bit unrealistic to think that we're ever going to get there. So I think we really need to sort of think more in terms of like, I know how we can sort of simulate or predict sort of local contexts and effects. But yeah, maybe others have better ideas.
No, that's completely true. I mean, there's always a question of resources of how to actually understand context, because participation is heavy. It takes a lot of time. Actually, I'm glad that we have here Julia, who will be commenting on that based on the granular context. But before that, maybe first I see Peter would like to react, and then Julia. Thank
you. Two areas of reaction. One on the measurement in the local context. For example, I think this analysis of really going down around the wind turbines and to see what they do, I think that's really great. But I imagine that it's far from straightforward. For some data, you may have access to administrative data, which can be totally localized, but of course it will not have subjective well-being because that you need to measure. Some people are trying to use, and that may be an interim way to use, I don't know, big data techniques, social media information, or I mean, most people are using their smartwatches, and that produces a lot of data. So these may be used in a very local context, so that can be a new source of information. But the other non-measurement aspect is I fully agree that the citizen engagement to build things from bottom up, also in terms of indicators. Okay, it's not just the objectives, but also what statistical indicators or what indicators are understood and trusted by people. And also this should not be just a matter of the experts. It should be also discussed with people. Social capital, for example, is something related, and it's a typically underappreciated aspect of all these beyond GDP measurements. But to me, there is even something broader. It's not just the measurement, but the local community can actually act even as a resource allocation mechanism. There is the market allocation, there is the state allocation, and there is the relational, the community-based allocation. And this should be somehow much more co-living. But I think this is not the beyond GDP, but much more the beyond growth, how to rewire the system type conversation. But I think these things very naturally flow from each other.
Well, naturally, actually, we can actually have further insights on the project, precisely on this very topic. So Julia would like to comment on that, I'm sure. Thank you.
Yeah, Serafin already understood what I wanted to comment on. And I apologize, I joined a bit later. I was actually going to join only the second workshop, but my meeting ended earlier. So I jumped also in this first one. And yeah, I don't have the yellow background of Granular, unfortunately, but yeah, I work with David Miller, we co-lead the work on rural proofing in Granular. And I maybe resonate quite a lot with both what Gundi and Peter said. So the participatory approach is super key. but it's of course difficult if we just give this, like if we only want to build on only, let's say, on the local level, we might miss some data, and there's some modeling capacities as well that not everyone might be able to have. And this is what we saw also in the first round we did. And this was especially when in our case, the living labs, they rural proofed something that is still to be implemented. So in case the effects are not seen yet, it was of course difficult, especially without any modeling facilities, etc., to actually kind of predict what the impacts would be. So it's a very fine balance between the availability of data and someone that can bring those as a kind of value added, and the local level putting the perspective and the context, like Serafin was said. So both are very needed, and this is a challenge we are having in Granular now, how to balance these two components, so to say. And if I may just bring a positive example, is the Finnish case. Is something that was also then we highlighted it in a couple of conferences, and also at their experience was highlighted in our session at the week of the cities and the region, because they had a very nice articulation of when they did the rural proofing. So they rural proofed Archipelago Act, and they had as main, let's say, orchestra director, so to say, Luc, the institute, so the researchers that gave a first impulse and populated some first areas of the rural proofing, and especially they brought some more maybe data in. Then they had the living labs that added the context. Then they had even the ministry discussing this, and then they had 2 loops or iteration. So the reason why we also, the other labs also did extremely well, but we found that also the quality of what was produced when having at the same time, so as rural proofers, both a scientific institute, the local level, the lab, and then even the value added in this case was also the ministry having the authority, the policy initiator directly also in there. Now, I also know that in certain countries, also depending on how if it's a federal state, etc., like it's also a bit difficult to have access to the authority so easily. I don't really know how they manage to have it so easily. I understand it's not always easy to get, your ministry coming to your granular living lab activity, but it's a very fine balance on actually who is the rural proofer and who contributes and brings data. And now we are initiating another round of rural proofing, so I'm really curious to see a bit what comes out. But indeed, like without a solid also database, it's not useless, because one thing we highlighted is that also the participatory approach anyway has a ton of positive ripple effects in terms of participation to the policy cycle, increase of trust. So this was like, there are a lot, so it depends also on the purpose of the rural proofing. If it's done to really influence the policy cycle, and maybe at a crucial moment of the policy cycle, then it's quite crucial to have also someone that brings in the data. Then maybe the local level can work with them, but that element kind of makes it more, not tangible, but like deliberate a bit, the exercise. Then this doesn't mean that we can also just do a whole rural proofing exercise just with local stakeholders, maybe not for the purpose of directly instilling it ourselves in the policy making cycle, and that could have other positive effects, as I said, in enhancing participation, etc. So, but if we really want to influence the policy, I think the data are quite crucial. Sorry for
Thank you, Julia.
comment.
No worries. That's why the compliments and it's additional insight from the project. I would like to make like a last round of questions for the speakers, and also being aware of the time. Actually, it's just in the connection with what we just discussed. I will start with Laura first, perhaps. the slide you put about the many beyond GDP initiatives is illuminating. I don't think I've seen one that has as comprehensive as that. So definitely something I'll go back to. And as you know, I mean, now your current position in SOE, of course, you have a global outreach. But it's precisely because you have a global outreach. And as you know, in the EU, we are basically redefining how we do public policy at the moment, with the excuse of the next EU budget. But that will have a ripple effect in many ways of policy making. And part of that will be discussed later today. So, building your experience first in Europe and now globally, what do you think we could actually, if you could tell Mrs. von der Leyen and company, what do you think you could actually do in terms of improving the current frameworks to better measure GDP, and that policy making is better abreast on those richer measures than perhaps we have at the moment? As I say, a completely open question that can perhaps give inspiration for us. Thank you.
A nice, easy one. Thanks, Serafin. I mean, okay, so there's quite a few different things I would point to, but I suppose if I had, 1 minute and I had to pick something, I would probably emphasize the need for, at European level, we need to be so much more joined up with the policies that we're putting forward, that still there's too much silo thinking. And I mean, Peter can say how hard I know the Commission is working to try and break this. And I think there's been significant changes over the 20 years that I've been in Brussels. And Serafin, you've been even longer, so I guess you can give a longer time span. But, there's definitely changes there, but still too much operates in its own silo. I'm watch this space because I'm super excited to see how the intergenerational fairness strategy, which has just been published a little while ago, like a week or two ago, how that might help influence the way that we're thinking long term in policy making, how we're thinking across portfolios in terms of the impacts of projects and policy design. So I mean, it's going in the right direction, and there's no denying it's just difficult. I mean, it's difficult from top to bottom because, Brussels can suggest a really all-encompassing policy or whatever you like, but it covers all sorts of different things. But then who discusses it? Because then you come down to the ministerial level, and at some point you're going to hit a portfolio. This suddenly then becomes the employment minister, or it becomes the energy minister, or it becomes the treasury secretary, whatever it might be. You end up somewhere in a silo, and then that then comes down to the next level and the next level, next level. And again, whether you're looking at local councils or whether you're looking at prime ministerial offices, it's so difficult to try and have that overview, which is why I feel like at least one of the most significant barriers to sort of making more progress in this way is that it has to be absolutely at the top level. It has to be from the leader of a country, or at least the leader of a region, who has to be promoting this approach. Because when we look at the best examples of taking this forward, it's been done by the leadership. It's been done in Iceland, it was done in Scotland and New Zealand, Finland, Wales, and it's been led by the leaders of those countries. So, you need that political understanding and emphasis, I think, to then try and move things further down the chain, if you like. So that would be my big ticket item. I'm sure I can find some smaller ones as well.
Well, that's completely true. And sometimes it's that. The big vision, unless you have leadership and you understand the implications for the chain, so it's very bad. And that's, for instance, in some cases, the SDGs, there's some countries like the one I know best that are top of the agenda, just because there's been this consensus across the multi-level system to approach that, whereas other places that are equally important, so you even think that you do this report every 4 years, and that's it. So you're actually bang on that. Maybe Peter would like to comment that further. Of course, your position as member of the Commission will limit yourself a bit more on that, but happy if you can, and perhaps and if you cannot, maybe you can actually elaborate something that is quite important, which is how to balance between having statistical data and capturing these complex social soft factors, because sometimes, and the many cycles that are being involved, there's always this thing, well, we cannot introduce this indicator because X country doesn't have data beyond national level or even regional level. And actually, one of my big regrets with Next Generation EU, there was not like basically, I don't know, a big package there to improve statistical data, because that will have a ripple effect on policy making and not just on EU funding if we had that. And sadly, that was not the main focus, or not even a key focus on Next Generation EU, because that would be an easy way of improving the statistical base of our EU. But that's where we are, the world where we are. So maybe you'd like to comment on that, how you best do to try to address the need of having accurate data and the difficult to capture some of the soft dimensions that are difficult to measure dimensions that we have been discussing today. Thank you.
So let me try to answer to this, and also connect to the previous comments and what Laura was saying, that you were asking to her in a bit going around type answer. So my I don't know, main proposal, but this is not originating in me. This is what Enrico Giovannini has been promoting for long. Is, think of what GDP, which is a single number with an underlying ecosystem, did. It was created in 1945 for a political reason. Okay, there was one to be able to assess whether the US, how much resources they have for the war, but the other one, which then led to its global gradual adoption, was to demonstrate that the West is not inferior to the East in producing stuff. And then we've been all discussing of how, I don't know, far-reaching, often negative implications this had. Now imagine we had an alternative, which is the same ecosystem with all the broken down things, but which is not about producing stuff, but about producing well-being. That would be a natural uniter of all these silo thinking. It's far from obvious, but that would, for example, bring in all those softer social ways. There are approaches which even bring in as an intermediate vehicle subjective well-being to have a monetization. Not everybody likes it, of life expectancy, to say that there is an equivalent income of that. So such a framework, but that would need to be designed, and that would need to be I don't know, matured like I don't know, various drinks for decades, because GDP has been there for 60 years by now, or 80. So that would be my suggestion, which would be uniting all the different type of data, and would be one single deep institutional change that may have very far-reaching repercussions, which we may not even be able to assess and imagine.
I would like to be positive, because JRC and the Commission, working with OECD, have actually achieved a significant part of what we call the Brussels effect, for instance, and that's connected with the question with Gundi. We have now a worldwide definition of what is urban and rural, thanks to the work you have done with, and then later with OECD, that actually then become the UN Statistical Commission definition of what it is urban, rural, and what is, and that's something that I hope the same line can be done in terms of well-being, as we have a track record in Europe to the lead on this. But coming on this of what is rural, because you Gundi, just to conclude this round, you should highlight how important it is defining depending what we define as rural, will have a completely different result in terms of the evaluation. So, as you know, there's a big discussion of what is urban, what is rural. There is a definition, there's a classification, and so on. But I don't like to comment further on this issue. How we should be defined rural in a way that we capture the right outcomes. And probably there's a contextual answer, but maybe we'd like to comment further, and I will leave it there. Leave it like a last comment here. Thank you. So maybe Gundi. I don't know if Gundi can hear us. No, it is the mic off.
My micro. I was clicking on it, and it was not responsive. So, so I think generally I very much welcome the definition of the Digurba 2, for instance, which doesn't just treat the sort of sparse sparsely populated area as one big sort of black hole, and instead differentiates between 3 different types of rural areas. I think that's a way forward. We've used this in the analysis for Great Britain, and then unfortunately found that in the sort of least populated areas, then in the national big surveys, we don't have enough cases to actually make sort of a good sort of political sort of or statistical inference. So I think if we want to continue doing this sort of more place-based sort of policy analysis with national surveys, we really need to sort of start over boosting or boosting sort of really local cases. And I'd like to say on the frontier of sort of getting measures like life satisfaction or social well-being, social capital, the quality of the social environment, as it were, into national accounting. I think we are on a good sort of track there as well. I think there is a lot of silos. There is a lot of sort of infighting within the science sort of research sort of groups as well. We all think that yeah, life satisfaction isn't like the perfect measure, but there I can only say, well, GDP isn't the perfect measure. You know, people have decided that this is like the strong horse that we run with, and it's been decided. So I think like we well-being researchers, subjective well-being researchers, we have to do the same, you know, make life satisfaction strong. There's already, it's a measure that's already in lots of surveys, and helps us sort of actually track changes and see in retrospect, basically by analyzing long time series, how different policies have impacted the life satisfaction of people, including by where they live, like whether they live in rural areas or not. And I think we have to continue doing that, because we can collect data now, but any data we collect now isn't going to really help us sort of solve this sort of rule proofing what matters for well-being. It's always going to be based on data that we have collected in the past. So we have to collect it now to have the benefits later. And we can't keep sort of collecting data and data and data and data. We have to sort of define like what we want to collect, because definitely in terms of the survey well, there is also survey fatigue. People don't want to sort of participate in surveys anymore. And I see that there's people from all over Europe in this sort of chat, and so I can really just encourage you all to basically invite everyone to participate in European surveys, such as the European Social Survey or the SHARE surveys, and etc. Like Europe really does have a fantastic infrastructure of longitudinal surveys that you know, that need our continuous sort of support. And if Europe then also sort of managed to have a sort of comparable sort of access structure to administrative data, then hooray.
Well, that's a good wish to have. I hope in 7 years from now will not you know, the evolution will have advanced, and I think we're going to spend a fair amount of that in the coming months. Actually, one thing, and just to give a hand to the next session, is why the Gorba 2 is not better using the performance framework. But you know, if you're interested, we're going to have a session in 50 minutes or so on that. For the moment, it's also for me to thank Gundi, Laura, and Peter for this engaging discussion. And I think I'm going to hand over to Merve, if I'm not mistaken, to do the transition to the next session. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Serafin, and many thanks to all of our speakers for this very rich and complementary perspective, and to all the participants for joining us on this session. This brings us to the end of this first session, the webinar number 8 of the GRANULAR Knowledge Transfer Accelerator, a platform for exchanging knowledge and solutions to support the territorial development of rural areas. We will now take a short 5 minutes coffee break, but please stay connected as we will continue shortly with the second webinar of the day. So don't go anywhere. We will be back in just a few minutes. Thank you so much.